admit that was fake news, but that's another day. We could spend a whole day talking about all that. But be that as it may, you know, when Mississippi State offered Chris Jones, there were two schools that went by Houston High School during the spring evaluation period to even check on him. It was Mississippi State and Memphis. And so there was nobody early on. I know. It's crazy. Now, of course, everybody's like, oh, we were on this kid from the beginning. No, you weren't. No, you weren't. You're embarrassed that you weren't, but you weren't. And so, you know, that's Dan Mullen had a policy that every high school in the state of Mississippi was going to get a visit from Mississippi State coach in the spring evaluation period and then the fall evaluation period. And that's what happened. And that's the benefit of being thorough. And Chris Jones, of course, stuck with Mississippi State. And a lot of that was because of the fact that State showed him so much attention early on.
Steve, who was his lead recruiter in Houston, or from Mississippi State in Houston, Mississippi?
You know, I can't remember who the area recruiter was, but you know, Dave Turner, of course, very involved in all that stuff. But,
right.
You know, really, Mississippi State back in those days, especially with the in-state kids, had really, you know, a by-committee approach. You know, where every one of those coaches was involved, whether it be in social media messaging or, you know, when the guys would come in. You know, Tony Hughes, of course, basically Tony's territory was the Magnolia State, and so, you know, Chris was the guy that was very involved in his church, and Tony knew the pastor. And so those things help, you know, when you've got a guy like Tony Hughes on staff that, you know, that kind of knows the lay of the land in the state of Mississippi. And I think that's one of the things, you know, State and Ole Miss right now are dealing with, is you've got a lot of guys on staff that are just learning about Mississippi recruiting for the first time. And every coach that I've ever had that's come to this state, they all show up and say, oh, yeah, I get it. And they leave here saying, you know what, it's a little different than I expected. And so there's a transition year, and I think we're seeing that really at State and Ole Miss both this year.
So, you know, it's interesting, Chris, his recruitment was fascinating, even before the last 3 weeks going into signing day. You know, he's a day one guy, Steve. It was still raw, but had some big moments as a freshman. I'm not sure that people give him the credit that he deserves. You know, people tend to focus on the negative. Did he take some plays off? Yeah. But, man, offensive coordinators and quarterbacks had to know where he was. I thought his wingspan was so disruptive for so many quarterbacks that faced him during his 3 years in Starkville. Steve?
Yeah, I think that's fair. You know, one of the things I thought Dave Turner did to really utilize that wingspan, especially on pass rushing downs, is they would move Chris over the nose in what was called the prowler package. You know, they had, you know, 3 down linemen down there, and you slide Chris inside to get more speed on the field, and that's where Chris really kind of took over. And you're right, there were some times, and I remember Fletcher Cox even tweeting out during the ball game one time, you know, why is Chris Jones getting pushed around out there? And those words made it back to Chris, and I think it was a good thing for him, because I don't know that he maybe fully realized that he was kind of inconsistent at times. But I know the second half of his final year at Mississippi State, there probably wasn't anybody in the SEC playing harder than Chris Jones.
Mm-hmm. $60 million and $85 million total. You know, Steve, people forget he made a couple of huge plays in the Super Bowl. And he's already got a Lombardi trophy. I mean, we focus on Patrick Mahomes, which is great. We'll always do that. But, man, Jones was Garoppolo, and that crew did not want any of Chris Jones in that game.
No, and that's the thing, too. Chris is so disruptive, even when he is not the guy making the play. You know, Chris is the guy that kind of makes some plays for his teammates, because he'll go out there and collapse the pocket and flush the quarterback, and then the quarterback steps into pressure. And while that doesn't show up in the box score for Chris Jones, it certainly is an impactful play when you go back and look at, you know, that Super Bowl highlight reel. I don't remember Chris really doing a whole lot in the box score, but he was the guy that certainly impacted the game.
Whew. So, man, isn't it hard to – all right, I'd like for you to evaluate, take stock, Fletcher Cox, Chris Jones, Jeffrey Simmons.
Yeah, well, you can also probably add Josh Boyd in there a little bit too. You know, Josh had a couple of good years in the league too. And but yeah, I think when you begin to look at Mississippi State's pedigree, what is Mississippi State known for? You know, a lot of people out there and say, oh, well, they're wide receiver U and DBU, and that's all great. But I think Mississippi State fans realize this state routinely produces Power 5 difference makers on a defensive line. We don't always do it on the O-line, but we do it on the defensive line. And Mississippi State has gotten the lion's share of those players over the course of the last decade, and then they've taken them and developed them and put them in the National Football League.
Mm. Steve Robertson on the Out of Bounds Show, genespage.com. Let's go to the baseball news. Walk us through what it means for all these other schools outside of Vandy and Michigan and Stanford and so on.
Well, you know, we're still kind of getting up to speed on exactly what the proposal is, you know, but I reached out to Chris Lamonis last night, and Chris said himself that, you know, he's still not exactly sure exactly how it'll impact, you know, Mississippi State just yet. We're just kind of waiting to see what exactly passes and how they plan to use that legislation. But, you know, one of the things that we have seen in the last several years is there's been an outcry of the true baseball power saying, hey, listen, you got to give us a chance to let these kids graduate without having to take their signing bonus to pay off their student loans. I mean, you know, it's ridiculous to think like a guy like Ethan Small goes in the first round, and the first thing he has to do is write a check to pay off his student loans. I mean, that's unfair because he excels in a different sport. I mean, I think it's ridiculous. But the way this thing would work is, based as I understand it, and again, just kind of get up to speed on this, is you're going to be able to stack academic aid on top of athletic aid. And that's one of the things, you know, in years past that really any aid was applicable. And so you couldn't really get around that part of the rule. And so basically now you're going to be able to use that athletic aid maybe for some guys that didn't necessarily have that wherewithal to begin with. Because, you know, if you've got 11.7 right now and you have to split it between 27 guys, well, all of a sudden you begin to think, well, if I've got a kid that excels academically and can get a full academic ride, well, I can classify that guy as a walk-on. Then I can use his portion of the 11.7 to maybe aid in a recruiting offer somewhere else.
Nice. That's a game changer, man.
Yeah, as we understand it certainly could be. And I've read some people reach out to me yesterday, and I don't know where this sentiment began. They said, oh, well, this actually helps Vanderbilt. No, it doesn't. No, I mean, Vanderbilt's fully funding baseball right now. Right. You know, so because of the fact they can use those need-based scholarships and then the Anchor Gold program. And so they're already kind of – and they're not cheating. People say what's unfair, and it is. But Vandy and Tim Corbin would be idiots not to utilize – you know, the legislation that is available to them just because they had the financial wherewithal to get it done, you know, but the bottom line is it is a loophole that has been exploited. And so as a result, it's created a competitive advantage that, you know, Vanderbilt, Michigan, some others have that the rest of Division I baseball doesn't. And so this is kind of a step towards leveling the playing field a little bit because listen, Mississippi State and Ole Miss and Southern Miss, they've got some kids that are great students that they could put on academic aid and then free up that athletic aid for somewhere else.
Yeah. All right. Steve Robertson, genespage.com. On the Miller Lite guest line, you can watch the show on YouTube Live. Search Out of Bounds Sports. We had John Cohen on yesterday, Steve, and he was more optimistic than maybe I expected him to be after their big meeting on Monday. Still plenty of hurdles to jump over. But, yeah, I do think it'll get delayed. I don't have, you know, nobody's telling me that on the record. But it sure looks like, even though the national media wants to pound and pound and pound negativity, that the NFL hasn't checked up, and they may even start on time, September 10th, and that college football could start on the Thursday night of, if it doesn't start on time, October 3rd. /October 5th, kind of a month later. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a couple things that I would say. It's so interesting that you know, once the NFL and the NHL and the NBA and MLS and those leagues said, "Hey, listen, we're going to play," you didn't have this angst among national sports reporters about any of that stuff. But man, God forbid we decide to play the college game, and all of a sudden people lose their minds. You know, I don't know if they're just tired of press box hot dogs or whatever, but it is a very interesting deal that we have so many people that have such hot takes about college athletics. I mean, it's like, I don't think they fully appreciate the fact that, let's say, for an example, that we just completely wipe out sports the remainder of this year. Do you think that these sporting companies are going to continue to fully fund the payroll? No, they're not. They're going to lay people off.
No.
So some of these same people that are cheering against college football will be the people to get laid off. I think there's a real lack of self-awareness there. But at the end of the day, too, there's a lot of people, Bo, and you know this as well as anybody, there are a lot of people in our industry that they are agent provocateurs. And so what they lack in talent, they make up with takes, these hot takes. And so they want to redirect your eyes. So let me write about the most polarizing thing I can possibly do to get clicks, because if you click on my article, then I get my view, and then we get our monetization, and so there's a revenue stream there. So I don't think a lot of these guys even believe what they're writing. I think they're just writing things to get clicks and get views, because I cannot believe any college football writer in the country would root against us playing college football.
That's a great point. The national college football writers have, a lot of them, have embarrassed themselves. So the schools are allowed to hold some modified practices in July because of not having any kind of spring practice, Steve?
Yeah, you're right. So this week, Bo, what happened is the workouts went from being voluntary to being mandatory on Monday. But coaches can go and observe and encourage, but they can't coach, they can't instruct. Everything is still under the supervision of the strength and conditioning staff. So like at Mississippi State, Tyson Brown's still leading the charge, but your coaches can go out there and kind of watch and just kind of get an idea of what their players are doing, who's healthy, who's performing well. And then I believe it's the 27th. I read the article yesterday, so I'm pulling this from memory. But so we got about 10 days or so of this left, and then we can introduce a football. Now we can have a walkthrough where Mike Leach can get out there with KJ Costello, and here's what we want to do on this play. So no pads or anything like that. We can introduce a football, and we can actually have, some actual football practices, as we kind of ramp up into fall camp. Now, this is where things get a little tricky because, the NCAA, I think it's 25 days before your opener, you can begin fall camp. But if they decide to delay the season, it'll be interesting what they do with the practice calendar, because this was set in place back in June when the Division I Council said, okay, we got to correct this spring practice thing. We got to give these teams a chance to kind of ramp up so we don't have guys going into the season, at less than 100% and then running the risk of injury. So that was kind of set and modified to tailor up against the schedule starting on time. So I could see conceivably if they decide in the next couple of weeks that, hey, we're going to delay the start, that they may actually delay the start of actual fall camp, and we've got the pads on and we're popping. So I think they'll probably extend that, that summer access period where we're still kind of in shells and shorts.
Steve Robertson, genespage.com on the Out of Bounds show. So let's move to JUCO. Them not playing until the spring, a lot of these guys will be gone. Their rosters. Who have you talked to? What does this look like? And how does this impact recruiting for Mississippi State and other SEC schools, considering a lot of these dudes roll out in December so that they're not there for the spring semester for Glenn Davis at Colin or Buddy Stevens at East Mississippi?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because I spent a lot of time yesterday speaking to junior college coaches and even a couple of athletic directors around the state. And the point that I keep bringing up with those guys is how do you put a roster together? How do you field the team in the spring, especially if you're one of the Power 4 or 5 schools in the state of Mississippi? Let's just say, for an example, Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College. All right, so that is a very sophomore-heavy team, and you've got some guys that have worked very, very hard to be mid-year graduates, and their plan is to graduate in December and enroll at their new school in January. Well, so some of those teams are going to have as many as double digits of those placement guys that are going to move on. And so if I'm Alabama and I got a kid that's playing at Mississippi Gulf Coast, I'm thinking, hey, listen, I know you're a May grad, but maybe you need to sit this thing out, because what happens, because of the fact all the December guys leave, well, then all of a sudden these other guys in the spring are going to have to play more reps. And so what if a defensive back, down at Colin gets hurt during the spring season, has to have off-season surgery, and now is now unavailable next fall for his new school. And so I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure put on a lot of these kids not to play. These kids that have already made their decision, they've already achieved something on the junior college level. They know that they have a Division I future ahead of them, and by not playing in the spring, it gives them 3 years of eligibility at the next level. And so if you're a junior college coach, you're thinking, okay, am I going to have to go out here, to the supermarket and walk around and say, hey, you got any eligibility left? And start finding guys during Christmas break to come and join your team in January, because you get 55 scholarships, Bo.
Right.
And here's the thing too. Let's say, for an example, what do you do if you're coaching at Jones County Junior College and you got half dozen kids that they come back for the spring, coach, we're going to play. Well, all of a sudden they're in the dorm, they're on your meal plan, they're on scholarship, they're in class, and then they decide, hey, coach, I don't think I'm going to play. I haven't really been feeling real good, and I need to make sure that I'm healthy. And so they're already on your aid and they're already on your scholarship roll, so that spot's already used, and they decide, well, you know what, I'm not going to play this spring. And what message does that send to the rest of the team? What do you do at that point? Because you can't. What are you going to do? Kick him out of school? You're going to take him off scholarship? That's not going to happen. And so I'm really, 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 really concerned about how our junior college programs in Mississippi are going to be able to field teams.
I don't see how this is going to work.
Well, then we're told that, let's say there was a lot of discussion about some people within the MACC abstaining from voting, and there was some talk about, well, they may just go on their own and play in the fall. Well, if they do that, then they're not eligible for the national championship. And so, I guess we've had 7 of the last 10 come out of the state of Mississippi.
I would
almost, when you begin to look
at, I would do that anyway, or strongly consider doing that, breaking away for this year.
Yeah, if there's no long-term consequences from that, I think
True.
That's something you should absolutely consider. At the end of the day, we want to keep everybody safe, and there's so many varying opinions about what the infection rates truly are and that sort of stuff. And so there are a lot of people that have a lot better education than you and I that are going to make these decisions. But It is an absolute nightmare what is happening in the junior college ranks right now. And it's not the fault of any of the coaches or administrators in Mississippi. That's what's important.
No. So do you think that they will, at the end of the day, do you think that they will decide to go ahead with the season in the fall?
I don't. I may feel differently a couple hours from now. You just never know, because I think that, if you're buddy at East Mississippi and you've got these absolute monsters on your team that are basically SEC players that are just kind of on loan to you, you've worked with them, you've made sure they had an academic plan, you've kept them in the weight room. I want to get benefit from that. I want those guys to be able to play. So I would say, the East Mississippis and Northwest and Gulf Coast, I'm sure they would want to play in the fall. And I'm not speaking for them, but it makes sense to me.
Right.
They would want to play. And if you're Mississippi Delta and Itawamba and Coahoma, you might feel a little bit differently. You might think, you know what, maybe spring is the way to go. And so point. I think there'll be some sort of division with that.
Okay. Are you expecting anything recruiting-wise in the next couple of weeks for Leach and the crew?
Well, I think, Malik Neighbors, the wide receiver out of Louisiana, we've been told for some time that there's a good chance that he would make a decision this month. And, has been leaning toward Mississippi State for a while. Very good friends with Teddy Knox, 4-star wide receiver committed to Mississippi State. But, that's the thing, too. It's been an interesting week, for Mississippi State. Kanaris Johnson out of Laurel, a guy that a lot of people expect ultimately to end up at Mississippi State, announces for Tulane. I think that is strictly a reservation situation. I think he's just trying to make sure that he has something. I think he's a very talented player. He's an SEC guy, and I think that's where he'll ultimately sign in the SEC. But that was a bit of a surprise. And then MJ Daniels out of George County, who was the top defensive back in the state this year. He has told Paul Jones and I both, State's in it, then he announces the top 6 without State. So go figure.
Recruiting. All right, Steve Robertson, genespage.com, 247 Sports on the Miller Lite guest line. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
Take care, brother.
So, interesting. Leach and Kiffin finally get to at least get on the field with KJ Costello and John Rice Plumlee and start the process. I don't know why the NCAA can't rip the Band-Aid off, Blake, and give them coaching access 5 days a week, 2 hours a day. It's not going to hurt. Actually, it's just going to help the kids. Live in the Bank Plus studio. The show is brought to you by RPT and Rick's Pro Truck, their new retail location in Gluckstadt, Madison County. We're live in the Bank Plus studio. We're spinning the out-of-bounds prize wheel at 9:15.